Now, religious and ideological discussions are amongst the most difficult. And here I have for you something that I prepared, which is a description of Christianity and Christians as portrayed in the Quran and the Sunnah. So let me talk a little bit about Christianity and Islam, because this is the no-holds-barred, warts and all basis for the division or any kind of argument that might exist as a kind of dialogue. It does seem evident that one of the biggest threats that must be overcome in the world is that there is a considerable difference between Christianity and Islam, and that ecumenism in religion, while apparently being all about peace and unity, could, if it only went so far, produce the opposite result. That is, it could unify the ranks of the Christians and the Muslims, and then they might clash. So that might not be a beneficial effect that could even come out there, although most of the proponents of ecumenism are very broad-minded individuals who presumably wouldn't feel that way. The points here are mostly for your view, and I've put in the Quranic verses dealing with this, and I do believe you will in any case find this useful because it has in it pretty much everything that deals with this particular question. Now, and there are some things which are good and some things which are bad on this kind of dialogic argument that might exist. But I guess the bottom line is this in interreligious dialogue. There are various forms of interreligious dialogue, one of which is pursued by a professor in my department who has the World Dialogue Project. And it is viewed by myself, as well as my non-Muslim colleagues, as being a hegemonic project, because his method of dialogue is, okay, here we are, we've put our beliefs on the table, now what will you put on the table? As if religious belief is something that you can bargain over. And going beyond that, he has made a list of world ethics, universal ethics, and he says, I'm going to take this to the United Nations so the United Nations can vote this into effect and impose it on every place. And that is simply a kind of intrusive, penetrating, hegemonic imperialism of thought that will not work because it will provoke the other. And it may be that sometimes we do provoke the other when we talk, but if we were to get acquainted across the divisions of religion and ideology, and I include ideology if someone has an idea, well, I don't belong to a religion and I don't believe in a religion. So I'm combining both. A dominant kind of thinking that rules your own life, which could be religion, it might be a traditional religion, it could be a private religion of your own, or it could be some kind of ideological commitment. And some people will say, well, I have no ideological commitments. I'm a complete agnostic, I don't believe in anything, and so on. But actually, that's not true. Everyone has some kind of past that has formed them and leads them to have certain types of commitments, and a person is being more realistic with themselves if they recognize that they have some kind of pre-commitments or other. And those could be very reasonable pre-commitments. It's not anything I'm arguing against. But the whole point here of the dialogue would be that instead of following my colleagues' hegemonic, or shall I put it in a maybe fairer phrasing, homogenizing version of interreligious dialogue, instead of following that and trying to homogenize everything, to minimize differences and say they don't exist and ignore them and pretend there are none and so on, it's far more realistic to engage in a real exchange of ideas, even if your ears are wounded by the discourse of the other and you hear what you do not like. Now, of course, that requires a great deal of tact and coolness and so on to not fly off the handle, and everyone cannot handle that, but it is necessary. The first thing is to recognize the legitimate basis of the other. And that means that the other has their own construction of their religion and the whole belief system and social system that comes out of that. The other has their own construction of that, and that has to be honored. What the other says about themselves, that is what you have to go with. And Muslims have been and still are just as prone to error on this point as anyone else in the world. Because Muslims will go and say, well, Judaism is blah, 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 and Christianity is blah, 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 and so on, making invidious comparisons and using that to validate their own religion and ideology. That has historically always been the way that people have worked. But it is only fair and right that people be more accurate about this. And accuracy is achieved by allowing the other to represent itself. Now, the role of technology and science here is that unlike the independent thought universes of the past, where each civilization existed sort of hermetically sealed and often had rules to enforce that. For example, the pre-modern Chinese rule, which as far as I know, it prevailed until the Opium War of 1839 to 1842, that no foreigner was allowed to ever learn Chinese. It was prohibited for foreigners to learn Chinese. Obviously, if foreigners cannot learn the language of 99% of your population, they cannot reach that population, and so that's isolation for you. And there were many hermit kingdoms, that is, kingdoms that refused at first to be, quote, opened by the West, unquote. Not only Japan, when Perry went there, but China, similarly, when Lord Macaulay went to Beijing in 1793, and his mission utterly failed, and he was totally rejected by the Chinese emperor. Burma, which fought wars to keep itself separated off from the West. And so. But the world we live in now isn't that world anymore. That world is dead. And anyone who thinks that we can go back to that world, it's over, it's finished. And maybe that's unfortunate and is something that one could bemoan, although others will not bemoan it. We'll say it's better to have a unified world where anyone can go anywhere. Clearly, though, we're at the stage of the world where anyone can go anywhere. Even Burma has lightened up recently. It used to prohibit tourism right into our own lifetime as a remnant of that hermit kingdom type of policy. And obviously now we have internet and we have international distribution of this, that, and the other thing. And this is a problem we have to deal with because we don't know exactly always how to react to that, and I can't provide solutions. But on the dialogical aspect of it, I can certainly say certain principles that must operate if we are to live in a peaceful, pluralistic world. So one of them is to recognize and honor the other and to allow the other to represent itself. Now, of course, I don't always do this because I teach world religions, so I'm representing, 13 other religions, and I'm not from them, but I try to compensate for that by ordering books which have articles written by practitioners of those religions themselves, rather than just some homogenizing textbook. Although I use those too because faute de mieux, there's nothing else. I mean, there's better books and worse books, and so, well, you all know that about having to choose books and what kind of sources you'll rely on when you're teaching. And the second rule would be this, that it's very vitally important and often not observed, including by the Muslims, to not compare one's own ideals with the other's actions. This is very commonly what is done. One compares one's own ideals with the actions of the other, and that's not really legitimate. Ideals should be compared with ideals and actions with actions. That would be fairer and more accurate if one did things like that. Obviously, Islam, from my point of view, has something to gain from the application of these principles, because it would mean that Muslims would be able to represent Islam. And on the whole, in the American media, Muslims have not been allowed to represent Islam. Of course, Muslims are allowed to create their own media products and distribute those because we have press freedom. But in the major networks and so on, the whole discourses about things are rather carefully constructed. And you will all have to admit that on the whole, more often than not, Islam is represented by Christian or Jewish or non-religious spokesmen or spokespersons of non-Muslim origin than it is by Muslims. Or, if it is represented by Muslims, often they are people with foreign appearances and accents who are used as foils by the moderator or the interviewer to portray an unfavorable view of the religion of Islam. And I can point to particular interviews where that has been the case. And on the other hand, what the other communities gain from that is that if the Muslims themselves also adopt these principles and allow the other religions to represent themselves instead of representing them, then the pact will be mutual, and there will be a two-way traffic on that point. For example, when we speak of the Palestine question, or the conflict of Israel and Palestine, which a Jew would describe as the land of Israel question, if anything, it is the case that the land of Israel is an important aspect of the ancient Judaic law, and it has been on the books for 2,000 years. In fact, more than that, because it's described in the Torah. And quite apart from whether the Jews actually had any historical presence on that land for much of its history or not, which is a point that may be disputed from either side, nevertheless, it's on the books as a significant concept in the Jewish religion. And so that's something that exists. And I admit that and state that. And that is something that can clearly be seen. And so to forward the discussion, then, one has to kind of listen to the other. And people are often not willing to do that. And on the Muslim side, that is the case as well. I mean, I can cite things that, would not impress you favorably about what Muslims think about the West in this, that, or the other respect. Some of these things come about through ignorance and so forth. But there's certainly room for improvement on this on all sides. And I think everyone can see that. The